Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as CMC. We offer 3 different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm speaking with Taggart McGurrin. Hey, Tagg, how's it going?
Hi, Nicholas. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about critical planning points for starting a pharmaceutical company. But before we jump into our topic for today, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Nicholas. My background is I have a BS MBA in accounting. I'm a CPA, and I also am a graduate of Temple University Law School. And I most recently served a pharmaceutical company in various capacities for the past 7 years, but most recently as president and chief financial officer and chief operating officer.
Okay, excellent. So let's start at the highest of high points. So what would you say are kind of the main points of starting a pharmaceutical company?
Biggest point is planning. There has to be a plan to access capital. That's key. So the access to capital is the first thing that needs to come into consideration. I'll give you an example. There's a friend of mine who was a tax attorney, and he saw an opportunity in the pharma space. And before he even reached out to a few of his colleagues to help him start this company, he knew that he had access to a very large group of high net worth investors. So he had a pool of capital in order to access as he started this company. Many companies, you can go out with the best thing ever, the best management team, the best commercialization strategy, and unfortunately, if you don't have capital, you can't get off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was going to say a few other points. One is you want to be sure that you start with a savvy board. And what I mean by that is you need to have a board that's committed to governance and all the checks and balances that come with that. My own personal opinion is that the CEO and executive chairman of the board position should be split. Why do I say that? I think that the CEO is in charge of running the company and needs to be held to account. And by reporting into the board, he needs to also report into the executive chairman, someone that is separate and apart from him or her, an objective person, so that the board can then, outside of the CEO's presence, discuss the CEO's performance, how they feel about the reporting, and ensure that any of those checks and balances are actually spoken about and continuously reviewed. The next thing after the board is that, and sometimes it doubles, right, is that there's a dedicated team that's full-time. I think that full-time teams are critical when you're not only starting a company, but that those individuals have a long-term view of being part of the company. When you go out to investors and you're originally pitching your idea and you're the faces of the idea, investors are underneath should be of the understanding, and usually are, that these individuals are going to steward the investment to the finish line, and whatever that finish line may look like. So I often see a lot of people in fractional roles, and perhaps at times I will admit that there's definitely a need for some fractional help, but I think that is more or less consulting or some part-time hours. What I don't see working and what I haven't seen work, and I've heard that it has been something time and again, people think, oh, we'll get a part-time CFO or a fractional CEO. You can't be half in. Pharmaceutical industry is extraordinarily complex. There's so many different facets to it. You need to have people there 100% driven on board for the task at hand. And that's what investors would and should expect. The last thing I'll say on this point is that there's got to be a clear mission with annual goals and objectives. Now, how does a startup company come up with annual goals and objectives? Just do it. However dynamic in the beginning, set a few goals. They can be aligned with your next value inflection points. They may be the only goals that you can come up with. But I think that having structure and having the ability to review and say, what is it that we're going for? And what period of time do we have left until we need to get there? What is the investor's expectation? What promises did we make? And along the way, sometimes you can slow it up or speed it down, depending upon what the performance has been to date. But I believe that it's absolutely critical to put those out first and foremost. And it shouldn't be this just nebulous idea of, okay, well, we're looking to get X, Y, or Z. It needs to be very specific. And of course, they'll get further refined and more clear as time goes on. But I think that that's just great housekeeping to begin.
Mm-hmm. Those are great points. Well, let's start at the top with the access to capital. Let's drill down into that a little bit. So how do you access it? You did mention, having access to, your friend or somebody that had access to some high net worth investors. Obviously, if you have that, that's a great head start. Say you don't, but let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Network is obviously key. And just because you don't have the network on day one, just like my friend happened to have it, doesn't mean that you can't expand your network to include pools of investors. One thing is that maybe perhaps those are one of the people that kind of hub and spoke. A lot of people are hubs and they've got spokes out to all different types of individuals. And maybe that's the type of person that you'll want to have as part of your board. That might be a strategic initiative for you to bring on someone that has that network to capital and has been someone that has been in front of those individuals before. Another aspect of this is just looking at groups of high net worth investors. You may not know them, but there are boutique investment banks that have tremendous Rolodexes of individuals that are operating within the pharmaceutical space, and they vet the opportunity and present, curate basically the best opportunities for investors. And it's also a great way for founders to really kick the tires on their ideas and see what questions are coming before you're even in front of investors. One thing I'll say is that, a lot of times the old saying is, if you build it, they will come. Not in pharma. It's not, if you have it there, they'll come to you. No, it needs to be a very concentrated outreach to specific investors, all different types of investors at any different time in the company's trajectory as it's moving along or its pathway forward. It changes, especially, depending upon what the opportunity is, what the next period of growth is, how much capital you need. But I really do think that most importantly, you need to make sure that you've got someone in your network, or you reach out and start operating with partners and vendors that have the networks to access the capital to get your company started. Another, I guess this goes hand in glove with network connections that have the capital to start the companies, is smart money over dumb money. And what do I mean by that? That's not pejorative. That's to say, look, it takes a lot of patience to be invested in pharma. It takes understanding. It is not by any means an emotional investment from an investor. It needs to be one that's devoid of emotion and something that they understand that this will take time. There will be challenges. There will be obstacles. And you want someone that's going to not only understand those challenges, but also be supportive of them, because there are more chances than not you're going to need more capital at some point along the way. And from that point too, the investors and the founders need to be totally in sync. So the vision needs to be totally clear with the founder, and they're able to communicate and articulate that vision to investors. And that's really key. There's a phrase, or a quote perhaps, from Denzel Washington that I always enjoy, and it's, without commitment, you'll never start. But more importantly, and this is key for pharma, without consistency, you will never finish. And that's clear. That's a very clear point of issue a lot of times in pharma, is that everyone's excited at the beginning. If you do eventually get that access to capital and you've expanded your network correctly, or you've gone out to your own personal network, inevitably people lose sight of the mission. All of a sudden they start to forget why it is that they came in. Things can get sloppy. And it really goes back to that patience and consistency that's needed by both the investors and the management team to ensure that you do indeed meet you do get to the finish line. Because look, in my opinion, there's no greater risk than pharma, because it's got so many areas of risk: commercial risk, financing risk, regulatory risk. The clinical risk. The list goes on and on. So it's key that investors and the founders management team are in lockstep.
Now, let's say I'm somebody with, I'm at the beginning of my journey to access capital and build my network. What advice would you give to that type of individual?
So one thing that I think is your first step should be look for people who've done not just done it before, but have done it well before. So something that is really, I mean, if you have an opportunity to use your network and reach out to an individual who's raised money, not only raised money, generated value, but most importantly, captured that value for investors. There's a lot of individuals out there. I think it's an overused term. They like to call them serial entrepreneurs. And yet that could mean that it's someone that goes out and starts businesses and companies and never truly captures they like to say they generate a lot of investor value, but if you don't capture it for investors, then you've failed, in my opinion, to deliver. And so I would really reach out to someone that has had those opportunities and get their insight. Say, what did, who did you draw on? What did you do in the beginning? How did you keep your group of investors supportive? And would you be willing to look at my opportunity? And can we somehow come up with a partnership here? Or maybe you'd like to be included in this journey, because there's nothing better than having someone champion your investor prop or your value proposition than someone that's already familiar with the investors and is a proven face in front of them.
Yeah. One conference that I know is pretty popular is the JP Morgan conference, which I think happens in San Francisco in January. So I know that's, and they actually have sub conferences right around it. So for anybody that's looking for capital, I know that is a place that they should keep in mind. Another thing that you were talking about was how there's a lot of excitement in the beginning. And then, and there's got to be consistency. One anecdote that I would share is I think it's human nature that we all operate in 90-day worlds. And it's for a highly complex, high stress, high risk environment, such as a startup pharma company. I think it's really important that there be a good meeting structure where not only you're having weekly and annual meetings, but making sure you're having really substantive quarterly meetings and establishing 90-day goals, so that we can look back at how did we do this quarter? Did we hit the quarterly objectives that we have? And if we didn't, why? And if we did, let's celebrate it. And then let's see what are our, and obviously we're creating these quarterly goals based off of our annual goals. But then, okay, what do we have to do this coming quarter to keep on track, catch up? Or maybe there's a new idea that we have to. And I feel those quarterly meetings allow for reinvigoration and help to keep everybody enthusiastic. So that's something that I would kind of offer to the conversation.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that an important component of those quarterly meetings is to have the individuals at the table challenging what's being presented, and has it been that good? And are we downplaying our challenges and really torquing or turning up our successes such that it's almost kind of a false narrative as you move forward? I think it's key to have people, they're not being negative Nancy's or negative Nellies. They're issue spotting, and they're trying to make sure that, hey, look, let's keep our pencils as sharp as possible. We can certainly celebrate the successes, but it's one of many successes in a long journey of what will end up hopefully being a true success.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of capital, are we talking, and are we restricted to venture capital, or are there other pieces or ways of accumulating different types of capital that you'd recommend?
Yeah, so there's all sources of capital. You can go out and you can get it from friends and family. You can get it from high net worth and ultra high net worth investors, healthcare dedicated, small healthcare dedicated funds, some very savvy healthcare dedicated investors, and that many people do that full time. family offices. Of course, there's the VCs, institutionals, there's private equity, the list goes on. I think what really is key is that you want to get quality. I mean, this kind of goes back to the smart money over dumb money. You want to ascertain what are the types of investors that we want. Not all money is good money. And not all investors that come forward and say, oh, I'm willing to, if you, for instance, I see a lot in pharma that there's folks out there, nefarious players that'll say, oh, well, if you give me some money to review and retool your deck, I'll introduce you to this, magical pond of investors. And it's just a bunch of garbage. I mean, it really takes away precious time, something that you have very little of in the pharma space. And ultimately, your time is better spent thinking, okay, with the opportunity that we have and what we've seen the market accept already and where we are, what is exactly the quality of investor that we want? What's the type of investor? And it's really based upon opportunity, the size of the investment, and what the ultimate goal of the company is going to be. A high net worth individual may be very happy with an exit during, if a preclinical asset makes it to phase 2. That may not be the case for a certain venture capital investor, and they may not, always, or they may not come in that early. So really understanding what the investors want and what their strategic investment initiatives are at any given point in time is going to be key.
All right. And I promise we're going to move on. I got one last question and then we'll jump into the investor pitch. Pitfalls. What pitfalls should the audience be aware of and stay away from? You talked about smart money and dumb money. Any other pitfalls that people should be aware of before we move on?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I made mention, I've come into encounter, unfortunately, a lot of people that profess to be very well connected, investors, et cetera, and they all have ulterior motives, and it has nothing to do with your strategy and planning or your goals. So if there's one red flag, I think the rule at hand is that there's 1,000 more behind it, and avoid those people like the plague. You do not want to walk the aisle with any investor and end up being, kind of left there, right? I saw that happen throughout the SPAC. I call it a pump and dump. All these SPACs coming out, and then a lot of them left these companies expecting a lot of cash, and they were left high and dry, and that really, it's for some of them it became fatal. Another thing that you just want to be aware of is that the investors that you're going out to, explain to, it is an exciting opportunity. You need to be, pitching an opportunity, especially when it's yours versus so many others that come across investor desks. But I do think that you need to keep your comments very transparent and objective, not only in the beginning, but all the way throughout the investment. What you don't want to do is go out and be so jazzed up about what you're pursuing that you start to overpromise right off the bat. Because if you start that in the beginning, you will never, ever catch up, and you will be constantly messaging over your skis. And that only results in investor disappointment, and ultimately you perhaps maybe not being able to deliver on what you first said you were going to deliver on, but then it just becomes very chaotic as you move through.
Yeah, awesome. There was a study done of CEOs, and shame on me because I talk about it all the time. I don't know where the study came from, when it was made, but people will resonate with the point. And what they tried to do is they tried to narrow down what if to one factor. If it's one factor that makes a CEO successful, what can we narrow that down to? And it's trusting your gut. So very simply stated, if you're going to investors and if they're not passing the smell test, something seems off, listen to yourself. And vice versa, if you're getting the warm and fuzzies, don't skip diligence, but I would say, trust your gut and continue down that path. So that's an awesome content. All right, investor pitch. What should we talk about as it pertains to that?
So it's not in the beginning. I think it's pretty simple, although there's a lot of different ways people go about it. But one thing is, investors are looking at the executive team and the commercial opportunity. The technical the technical aspects of the asset are certainly one thing, and they are what they are, right? Science is science. That having been said, the executive team and the commercial opportunity are key. You can have a bad asset with the best executive team and a really sweet commercial opportunity, and that would still be a good investment, right? So it's key. But if you have a really great asset and you've got a terrible investment or executive team, and the commercial opportunity just doesn't amount to much, that's a loser, right? So I think, in the beginning, when you start to go out and talk about what are we as an executive team going to do, you need clear value inflection points. It's a term that gets used time and time again, but I like to call them checkpoints. You need to be able to say, all right, this amount of money is going to give us this outcome. So, they need to be very well defined and achievable and realistic timelines to be able to reach those deliverables. Because ultimately, and as I mentioned before, overselling and under delivering is always a recipe for disaster, and it's certainly not going to engender support amongst your investor base. And again, I mentioned before, you're going to need to go back at some point, more likely than not, and ask for investors to continue supporting the company if you meet inevitable hardship during the company's growth. I think another thing that I like to see as an example, I'll say, is that, and it doesn't happen, this isn't with all companies, but I like defined business models. And an example of that would be, we're building this to sell. So we need X amount of dollars to get X data. And at that point, here's some, other comparables of where companies have exited, partnered with larger pharmaceutical companies. And that type of return profile is something that those investors in the beginning are looking for. It keeps things simple in what is a very complex endeavor. I like to say discrete dollars for discrete outcomes, right? There's a certain amount of money, and then there's the outcomes that we can expect from that. That's not, you can't say that with any sort of certainty. No one's an oracle. We don't have a crystal ball. But I think if everyone's on the same page in the beginning, understanding that there may be some curveballs that are thrown and trying to issue spot them ahead of time, you're in a good spot. And, ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to flawless execution by the management team. It really always does. And that doesn't mean that there's not hiccups along the way, but there needs to be flawless execution. And I mentioned before, the CEO can't go his or her skis. You just absolutely can't. And lastly, as you're looking at, the investor too, you're pitching to the investor. But what I heard from a very savvy investor, he had mentioned to the group saying, look, no one ever comes and asks what type of investor we are. What other companies have we invested in? What, can we get some recommendations as to certain folks that we can check as references, other executive teams? How is this investor? How do they support you along the way? What support did they give you beyond just, money? That to me was, I think, very sage advice, and something that I never see anyone do, making sure that, hey, look, they just, as much as you're pitching yourself to the investor, I know a lot of time, obviously, you're so engrossed with trying to get the cash necessary to get to the next milestone, and time's never your friend. But just take a step back and say, hey, wait a minute, is this something that we want on our team too? Because it goes both ways.
That's great. So what I heard, and pardon the acronym, but you want to sow your oats. So opportunity, asset, team. And then, one of the overall themes is just being really clear, transparent, not overselling things, right? There is certain things, phrases that drive me up a wall, nails on the chalkboard. And maybe not everybody agrees with me, but I'm going to throw this out there. Please don't say that you're in the business of exceeding expectations. I really don't like that. You should be meeting expectations, not exceeding expectations. Otherwise, you did a bad job of setting the expectation. The other thing I really like, which if we're in the topic of talking about trust, right? Transparency and all that kind of stuff, is you definitely want to talk to them about what you can do. But what's equally as important is talking about what you can't do. right? Now, obviously, there's two ends of the spectrum, right? You got the people on one side, yes, we can do this, we can do that, we can do this, we can do that. On the other side of the spectrum, well, just right off the bat, I can't do this, can't do that, can't do this, can't do that, right? There's a happy medium, right? So you definitely want to come out with a level of enthusiasm, talking about what you can do, what you're, excited about, the opportunity and all that kind of stuff. But set the expectations about what challenges you're expecting, things that you think are unreasonable, that you're right off the bat, don't be expecting this to happen, and here are the reasons why. Because it definitely, I think, puts people at ease when you're touching on both. If you're all one, or if you're all yes, I can do everything, that's going to send one message. If you're, hey, right off the bat, I can't do this, 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 and this, that sends another message. So there's going to be a little bit of a balance, I would say.
I agree. You can't be everything to everyone. And so I mean, it's what you want to do, versus what you can't do or don't want to do, I should say. And then there's the middle there is just being malleable and flexible to take opportunities as they come along, or change pace or a direction as needed, given the fact that there's a lot of unknowns. You can control a lot of knowns, but there will always be unknowns, and I couldn't agree more.
Now you said oftentimes people don't ask the type of investor they're talking to. I got some follow-up questions on that. Number one, why don't you think people ask that? Number two, why do you think they should be asking that? Number three, what type of information should they be looking for that would be useful?
Sure. So I'll tackle it in that order. I think it's akin to when you go in and you're interviewing for a job. You're trying to sell yourself to the employer, and that's your main focus. Trying to show them that you're shiny and bright and the best thing that's crossed their desk in a long time. I think that I'll use the same analogy here, that if you're going into that job interview, what do most people ask at the end? What questions do you have for me? You don't have that from investors. So without the prompt, you don't necessarily, say, oh, well, and honestly, if you're going into those investor meetings and you don't have questions for the investors, that would detail to me, if I was sitting there as an investor, that perhaps they didn't bother to Google my name at all. Right? I mean, you have to be able to come up with at least one question, or you would think that a leader of a company would want to know a few things about the investor, because again, they go back to the board. You want a whole profile of who's coming into your family. I mean, this is there's a small amount of people. It's a family unit. And the questions that you can ask investors, I mean, they vary. I think a lot of it has to do with whatever due diligence you come across, and as it fits your specific company profile and the opportunity. But I mean, at bare minimum, I think that you want to get some references of companies that they've worked with and reach out directly to those management teams. I guess I'll just mention in point, one of those calls could save you an awful lot of stress, struggle, and the potential for what would be a disastrous end to what otherwise would have been a success story, if you just get the right information. Knowledge is power.
And I'll say for anybody that and I don't know if anybody else that's listening to this feels this way, but I can tell you I've thought of this before. References are a waste of time. That's the story that's gone in my head. Of course they're going to give me good references, right? Not true. Not true. You should ask for references, and the references will be honest. And if you get a reference that's not glowing, you need to really take that serious. So definitely ask for references. Definitely pay attention to what they say. And if they're not glowing, that says something, because if they couldn't get a glowing reference, what does that say about the rest of the client base?
Absolutely. And one other thing I'll add to that, Nicholas, is be specific with your questions. There was a certain case that I heard where I had asked someone, I said, well, did you tell them when they called what your thoughts were, and knowing that they weren't necessarily the most favorable thoughts? And the response was, no, they never asked me the questions to elicit those answers.
Very good
And
point.
I thought that was a powerful statement to make, because as much as that individual maybe wanted to share with them the information that they had, they certainly weren't going to disparage them just outright without being asked the question. And so be specific in your questions, and if you think you're getting an answer, dig a little deeper.
Yeah.
Dig a little bit deeper. Sometimes peeling back the onion one layer will tell you all you need to know.
Yeah, the reference might not feel comfortable coming right out and being radically candid. However, if you ask a very direct question, hopefully you'll put them in a comfortable position to give you a direct answer. So,
Right.
absolutely. Okay. Conflicts of interest, leadership team, shareholders. Let's talk about that.
So this is one of my favorite topics, perhaps because of my background in accounting. I always remember the phrase, be independent in both fact and appearance. Rarely can you be both independent in fact and appearance. There are probably a small percentage of occasions where that might be, but conflicts of interest are always an issue. And even if they're not an issue in the immediate term, things happen. Humans are humans, right? So personal motives can and normally will hijack investor value, even in the best circumstances. So, I generally have seen that when things are going well, you're moving along okay, then you hit some hardship or tough times, and then everyone's really battening down the hatches and trying to basically dig through the trenches to come out and get over whatever hurdle there was. And at that point, you think, boy, now we've got a clear road, a clear path ahead. The skies are clearing, and this is an opportunity for us to potentially get to our next inflection point, or partner exit, et cetera. Those are usually the times where the conflicts come back out, because you've just gone through something very hard. And if there's a founder or a member of the executive management team, or even the board, that has an opportunity to, we'll call it, just take something off the top, it does hamper their judgment. It certainly is something that, if you've got 2 feet in both camps, right, you can certainly make the right call. But again, people are humans, and how are we ever going to really know what their personal motivations are, or what's going on in their own personal lives? Maybe they're not they're not setting out to have the conflict hurt the investors in one way, but people get into weird situations, and unfortunate as it is, they do bad things to try to fix whatever their personal situations are. Another piece to that I'd say is that when you look at founders' conflicts of interest and just their profile in general, people like to say, oh, this person's had past success, or they seem like they've had past success, so that's indicative of future performance. It's like stocks. That's just not the case. In fact, I'd say that the opposite. If you see that the individual has had maybe a lack of success, that may be even more indicative of what you'll see in the future. And generally, those individuals, you more likely than not, have had something that was a conflict of interest that allowed them to benefit or enrich themselves to a certain degree, regardless of the outcome of the company. And so you really got to be, you've got to be walking hip to hip, side by side with investors. If investors are losing, the management team should also be losing. There needs to be a synergistic, shared interest in the company becoming a success. If your downside is protected, right? If it doesn't matter at a certain point, what good would that be? What kind of profile would that be for an investor to say, oh, well, this person's going to really continue to dig in for us and move this ball down the field? No, you could be at the 1 yard line. And if there's something that makes it easier and takes the risk away from the person stewarding along the investment because of a conflict of interest that has gone unchecked, that, in my mind, that's something that's a huge area of risk, for sure, without question.
Yeah. Thinking about the the management team, because there's got to be a lot of synergy between the management team and the investors, and we want to try to reduce the opportunity for conflicts. What type of insight and advice would you give as it pertains to the leadership team?
So I think that the leadership team also, there's normally you'd see people, let's call it a group of 5, maybe one of them is coming in and they have a little company and they're licensing this asset into this new co right now, and they're going to go out and raise money. So there you go. There might be a conflict of interest there, right? They hit certain milestones. That other company will get paid. I think that in the beginning, it can be exciting and people will say, oh, and let's get going. The team's excited. This is a great opportunity. Let's say that they've got access to the capital. Slow down. Really say, hey, look, be able to say no, be willing and able to say no, and say, I'm not comfortable with this. You'd be surprised how many other people on the team would say, hey, we need to ask more questions about this, and we need to restructure this off the bat, because what we want to do is have the highest probability of success. We don't want to see impaired judgment down the line. And by the way, who starts the game may not end the game. So, there's relief pitchers for a reason. So what ends up happening is, as you move along your trajectory, the team that is there, even if they're, consistently keeping those checks and balances and good governance in order, well, if some of those players fall off the field and the other one that has the conflict is still there, then that's a recipe for disaster, right? Mm-hmm. So, I think that 2 things. One is that you want to have an you want to have an executive management team that is really strong in their convictions and ensures that every single one of the people that's, starting the game they're all on the same level. They're all in it together. And they have fortitude on what their mission and strategy is. A lot of management teams, they'll go out in the beginning, middle, and it doesn't matter. And they'll source opinions from bankers, investors, and partners. And unfortunately, they can just very quickly become corporate strategy, or that's the best practice at the given time. And again, they're more or less sound bites. They may sound good in the moment, even at the very beginning of companies, but inevitably, you've always got to look downstream and around the corner. Where are the potholes? You let your corporate strategy at any given time get hijacked. You've brought in, basically a chaotic opinion into an already complex organization. Again, whatever stage it's at. So I would say that, one, the management team needs to really vet each other first, the same way that the investors are going to vet them. And 2, they need to ensure that they're they hold strong and true to their conviction of what the mission and strategy of the company is, so that along the way, there's no outside, opinions or suggestions that automatically hijack the company's direction. And all of a sudden, underneath extreme pressure, they say, well, maybe this is the right way to go. No, you've got to rely on your own good sense and exactly what you're going after and what the team wants and what the investors expect.
Here's an adjacent question. So, especially in clinical stage companies, there's gaps in capital raises. So they'll be running a clinical study and there'll be a gap in time. Now, in my opinion, my experience, if somebody has equity, they can, and they're individually wealthy or well off, they can kind of disappear for a little while and then come back when the capital comes back, or they're involved in the next round of capital raise. However, if somebody is a W-2 with no equity and the capital is gone and they're working toward the next capital, they might be willing to wait for a certain amount of time, but at some point they might have to tap out and say, I'm gone. Now that person's gone. They're not coming back, because now they've signed on to a new career. So one of the other things that I've seen, and I want to get your opinion on this, it's not so much a fractional type of person where it's a portion of their time. It's a full-time person. However, they're they're typically subject matter experts in their field, and they're independent. So they'll come in as a chief development officer, a chief medical officer, a chief scientific officer, and they'll come in and they'll be full-time, 1099, no equity, whatever. Now again, there's a gap in capital. They'll disappear and they'll go and do consulting for a period of time. But now, once the capital comes back, it seems to me for them to come back, and it's easier because they are independent. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so this goes back to something I mentioned before, is that you've got to get the right team off the bat, and you've got to be 100% in. There needs to be I believe, a small core group of people. I mean, I don't think that at any given point it really should exceed somewhere between 5 to 8 individuals, and that really can include board members as well, if maybe 10 at tops. But to your point, yes, there's a core squad that needs to be, hey, look, there's a certain time. I'm a W-2 employee. I'm full-time here. I'm incentivized to get X, Y, or Z done by X, Y, or Z time. And I'm not just able to go out and go anywhere. Well, what's the big area of risk for them then? Well, as you said, those capital gaps, which sometimes can become chasms, they lose their ability to entice a 1099 subject matter expert because they've decided to take on another gig somewhere else that is paying at that time, or they won't work for free. I think something that needs to be put out up front, and a lot of times I think they use them as advisory boards, or it's good to have faces, right? I mean, that's really more or less faces of people that are known in the industry. But while that's nice and might make people feel comfortable, the real question I think that investors and executive management teams need to ask is, what are we doing to incentivize our subject matter experts? And how are we really, making great use of the team such that we're not pouring money out where we're now sitting in a tight spot where we've already paid them all the money, yet we still need them along the way. There needs to be some incentive comp or long-term incentive. One thing I heard of that was very interesting, and it actually came from a discussion that had nothing to do with pharma, is that sometimes they have reverse vesting, which I never heard of that before. And I just recently heard of this, and it was, we're going to give you all the stock up front, and as long as we meet our goals and objectives by a certain time point, great, you will, you were able to keep it. It's vests on day one. But if you don't, you either immediately all at once, or it starts to pull back, your equity starts to come back to the company. And I think that's interesting for many reasons.
It's the same picture. It's just the negative.
Yeah, correct. Negative. that means that, hey, look, I just can't go off and come back, because a lot of these 1099 employees have equity with the company. But if they can continue to vest just because of their time there, as opposed to, hey, I need to help them get to a certain, endpoint to ensure that I don't lose this or it doesn't start unraveling. I think that's one way that you can keep them interested in your company versus,
it seems more exciting, the reverse.
It is. And I mean, not everyone's going to go along with it, but I think you could sweeten the deal and say, hey, look, we'll give you a little bit more. And that does help people stay with you and really concentrated, because they just can't stick around for 2 years, have a lot of it vest, and then once it's vested, they leave, come back. It doesn't matter. They'll go on to whatever is paying them the most at that given time, or another project. So I think getting unique and creative with that is also another piece of the puzzle.
Well, this is a great transition into our last topic, which is, how should the company grow with the stages of funding?
So there's a couple. It's going to start and end. So I try to look at, the culture. You probably hear I'm big on culture. So the culture risk, and that starts at the beginning. It changes along the way, but it starts at the beginning. You look at the technical appeal of the asset, the market opportunity, the commercial opportunity, what the go-to-market strategy is, or what your strategy is, period, for how you're going to hand it off to the person that's going to be the entity that'll be commercializing that. The total addressable market that you're looking at. And, I think that it's important to not overstate how you hear these massive numbers. We get it, that there's a market for it, and that you don't need to go above and beyond. And then again, culture risk. So as you're going through different stages of funding, you need to continually check what's the culture, because inevitably you're bringing in new people, or there's new consultants, there's new faces, there's new vendors, partners. those things can become extraordinarily disruptive. And sometimes you need them to be disruptive too. So checking on all those pieces. I constantly think that as you're moving through, the biggest area of pain for investors is being left in the dark. So outlining every quarter, your if not early, if not earlier or sooner than that, or more frequently, challenges and opportunities, being transparent and sharing the information with stakeholders, and not just investors, but everyone that's involved in the company, because ultimately, leaving investors in the dark, you're going to be scaring them, be like, what's going on? One time I heard somebody say, well, what if I don't have an update? I said, that's the update. That's it. I mean, people want to know that, hey, look, they get it. Investors understand. It may not, every quarter may not be this really meaty investor update letter that's going to, generally life doesn't work that way. Not every 90 days do we get to throw ourselves a party, right? But understanding that we're still planning on having that big party is a key piece to ensuring that investors, again, remain supportive and knowledgeable of what's going on at the company and well-informed. I think, people like to grow very fast at times, and it's key to remember that you have to be nimble and efficient. That's the beautiful thing about being a startup pharmaceutical company. You don't have all the red tape and the layers of management to get through. You can move and operate much differently than a larger pharmaceutical company can, just by the nature of your size. It can quickly devolve into being a Frankenstein, though. You do not want to be moving so fast and being so nimble that all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, like what are we doing exactly? Or we've decided to bring on this person or this partner, and we spent money here. It ends up being, okay, well, from an investor standpoint, what do I own now? Where are we going? I've lost track of what I thought was a simple story. And I think ultimately one thing that everyone, any founder, management teams, they need to just go back and, as you said, quarterly kind of check-ins just amongst the team. But really, even if it's just once a year, because there's a lot going on for this purpose, is to say, look, what was our initial mission? What did we write it down before you start and go back to it? Because getting back to your roots, so to speak, here is going to be key to just keep yourself in line. It's very easy to stray. There's a lot of conversations people have. There's a lot of opinions that everyone has. There's a lot of motivations for people that have those opinions. But going back to, wait, before I started talking with anyone, what was my initial vision? And who are the people that are now around me as operators that are implementing that vision?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. The one thing that I would add to that is just about the quarterly updates and not having an update. In my opinion, if the quarter is such that you need to chop down what you can achieve within 90 days, then chop it down, right? And the acronym that I think a lot of people are familiar with is SMART: specific, measurable, attainable. I change the R to relevant and timely. So so even if over 90 days, this is what I can achieve, well, okay, then in 90 days, let me see if you were able to achieve that. It doesn't always have to be this big. But definitely we want to make sure there's progress, because showing up after 90 days and saying, I don't have an update, for some investors, that might be acceptable. If and when I become an investor, I might not be as nice. So, well, this has been a really awesome, amazing podcast. Before we wrap things up, anything else you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I just leave with one comment. Again, when you're starting a company, I think we have so many experienced leaders in the pharmaceutical industry, and people are living longer, working longer. They don't want to retire. And what I'm seeing, especially as a young executive, is that there's a growing gap, and I'll even use the term, it could become a chasm, and I used those terms before, but the gap right now is growing, where you've got young, talented individuals with more diverse or unique backgrounds that can really be well applied to a startup environment. And then you've got these extremely experienced and many times successful, many times over, individuals that can take all that past experience and match it with that fiery young talent. You can really not only close the gap, but also I really think that that's a way to make that startup environment just light it on fire from the beginning. I mean, you've got the different types of energy. You've got, and moreover, you've got the faces of people that can instill the confidence, and then the younger talent that really can get and roll up the sleeves. And it's a great way to pass the torch as well.
Yep, I love it. Well, Tagg, thank you very much. And for everybody else, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time.